Hello, my name is Emma Ward, and I will be presenting my research project that addresses discrimination in the U.S. agriculture system by centering on BIPOC voices. So the U.S. agriculture sector has historically discriminated against Black, Indigenous, and people of color farmers, which stands for BIPOC farmers, and noticeable policies of this include the Indian Removal Act of 1830, Japanese internment camps during World War II, and more recently, the Pigford versus Glickman 1997 legal case, where USDA discrimination led to economic losses for Black farmers, and lawsuit settlements were never distributed. Policies, capitalist economics, large farms, and corporations negatively affect farmers of color by concentrating power and resources in the hands of a few who control the majority means of production. So addressing the possible discrimination factors that farmers of color might face leads to an inclusive agriculture sector. So my research question first aimed to tackle, do BIPOC farmers in the US face discrimination today? And if so, what are the main forms and how can they be addressed? My methods to complete this were during my internship at Fair Start. I interviewed local BIPOC farmers, and while collecting donations for the nonprofit Fair Start, I was able to ask them individual questions about their experiences, their stories, and their opinions of what they would like to see moving forward. So in my results section, which is in the middle column of my poster, you can see this graph that represents recent USDA census data. BIPOC farmers, as you can see, have dramatically less access to land in the form of total percent acres, which is seen in dark green, as well as less access to farm-related wealth in the form of loans, seen in orange. BIPOC farmers also face dramatically lower levels of total percent of commodity sales, which is seen in the purple on the graph. So the graph demonstrates that white farmers do hold disproportionate levels of total acres as well as total wealth, which is intensified by the following forms of discrimination that I am now going into. Firstly, land discrimination poses significant challenges for farmers of color, as limited access to owning land leads to reliance on renting and leasing, which means lack of long-term security and control, which hinders investments and sustainable farming practices. Also, discriminatory lending practices was mentioned by each farmer that I interviewed, as they all felt excluded from capital in different ways and were subject to unfavorable loan terms and higher interest rates. Farmers of color face challenges with market discrimination as well, as accessing fair markets and receiving equitable prices due to limited access to mainstream distribution channels is a challenge. This is attributed to difficulties in establishing connections with key industry players, as well as meeting certification requirements that hinders their access to larger retailers and food service providers. Lack of representation in organizations and in governments is also a critical issue and a form of discrimination, as it affects resource allocation in the agriculture industry. Without adequate representation, the concerns and interests of farmers of color may be overlooked, which leads to ineffective policies that fail to support them. Also, the lack of accurate data on loan application outcomes and instances of discrimination is another issue that was mentioned, as it hinders the availability of resources and assistance as well as funding. Insufficient data collection on loan applications, approval rates, loan amounts, and more fail to capture the experience of BIPOC farmers and make it a challenge to identify disparities. Also, language and cultural discrimination poses challenges for BIPOC farmers, as hindering their access to resources, markets, programs, and education is due to their English being a second language. This language barrier exacerbates discrimination and creates hurdles in understanding grant and loan applications, as outreach and assistance are predominantly only available in English. There's also a limit of support for improving English language skills. Lastly, another form of discrimination that was mentioned by the farmers I interviewed was higher exposure to toxins and pollutions and increased loss of commodities due to hazards and climate change. Discriminatory practices like zoning, waste disposal, and industry locations have historically placed BIPOC communities and farms in areas with elevated pollution levels. So limited access to resources and infrastructure, such as advanced irrigation systems or weather monitoring technologies, or even crop insurance further exacerbates this already dangerous level of vulnerability to climate change and climate issues. So the key takeaways that each of the farmers mentioned that they would like to see moving forward are mostly outreach and technical assistance through policies and programs that offer education, training, mentorship, and guidance through either government programs, nonprofits, or agriculture extension offices. This does require a redirection of funds or a reallotment of funds in the upcoming 2023 Farm Bill. Addressing environmental injustice is necessary, as species diversity and access to crop insurance could counteract disproportionate negative effects of climate change. Also, increased regulation of pollutions, pesticides, and fertilizers could also lower disproportionate negative effects on farmers of color. Representation of BIPOC individuals locally and in government is required moving forward, and this can be done through voting politicians into office that speak on farmers' rights, or increasing support of nonprofits working together with government agencies and extension offices. Increased data collection on the frequency and impact of discrimination is also mentioned is also important, as I mentioned earlier, as there's a huge gap in the data currently available. And lastly, community aspects that have the opportunity to counteract BIPOC farmer discrimination is cooperative ownership models and community-supported agriculture programs that directly benefit these farmers by providing collective decision-making, resource sharing, market access, and stronger community relationships. So overall, the broader significance of this is essentially combating discrimination, which has been a long-standing historical issue in our country. Economic empowerment can be achieved if we start tackling these issues, as well as food security and food resilience with our growing population and increasing climate change. Environmental stewardship also can be achieved, as well as social justice and social equity. So community development overall is a huge proponent, a huge possible area for growth for implementing and addressing these forms of discrimination, as innovation and knowledge exchange is only encouraged as more people communicate and talk together. So overall, I hope you enjoyed my presentation. If you want to speak about it more with me, feel free to email me at eward2@uw.edu. That's EWARD, the number 2 at uw.edu. Have a great rest of your day.